Has everyone got a seat? All right, fantastic. We'll kick it off because it's 2:30 sharp. So our next panel will be about who will own digital trust in 2030. So we've got the fantastic Tahani Leche, General Manager, Identity and Fraud Digital Services at Equifax. So welcome everyone to the panel. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Lucinda. I trust that everybody's had a great day and a half during this conference. And meanwhile, about 400,000 instances of account opening have also occurred in the last day and a half. So this is our personal information coursing through the digital economy. And that's just account opening, so that doesn't include when you're logging back in to access services or when you want to process a transaction. And so every time that our personal information runs through the digital economy is also an opportunity for an accidental data breach or maybe even a deliberate fraud attempt. And so, you know, while our data is travelling through the digital economy, who is responsible for keeping that information secure? How much of that data should not be travelling through that? And how much of that should be, actually? And more importantly, who will own digital trust in 2030? So today, I'm very privileged to be joined here by these esteemed panellists that I'd like to quickly introduce. Stuart, I'm going to introduce you last, as you know. John Shepherd, First Assistant Secretary from the Department of Finance, looking after digital identity and data policy. David Hyland, founder of ID Partners. And Stuart Stroyan does not need an introduction because he's the Intersekt social butterfly. John, what does digital trust mean to the Australian government?
So, big question, but the government has a number of trust schemes that people will be familiar with, things like Consumer Data Right, e-invoicing, SuperStream, the Data Availability and Transparency Act, to name just a short list of many. But I think from my perspective, trust starts with knowing who you're dealing with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, which last year was instilled in the Digital Identity Act, or Digital ID Act, 2024, which really sort of underpins our digital ID system for Australia, which is a whole of economy system that's secure, convenient, inclusive and trusted. And I think, you know, that goes to what are those kind of key elements. Trust starts with inclusivity, security, privacy, and accessibility, and we note convenience because people won't use something that isn't easy to use. So just a few thoughts to start with.
Fantastic. So how does industry, including FinTech, think of digital trust?
Yeah, I think the last point that John made there around convenience is absolutely right. So yes, we have to protect, but if we protect to the point of smothering, where the actual ultimate utility of what it is that we're protecting becomes invalid, is no longer functional, becomes too difficult, or is adding, you know, layers and layers and layers of effort, then there's a question there as to what is it that we're actually trying to achieve. Yes, tick, we protected, but we protected by building a fort that's impenetrable both in and out. You know, locking a prince or a princess up in a tower protects the prince or princess, but they don't have much of a life. So how is it that you actually enable the convenience, but also have that broader understanding of consumer usability and functionality and ultimately utility? It's still an end product that has to be solved, of which digital trust is one component.
Yeah, it's about understanding and respecting how you earn the trust of your customers. Like, you don't want to go and create a circumstance where you're asking for too much or getting in the way of them loving your product because they feel like you're getting too much. Or what do you want that for? What are you doing that for? So yeah, it's all about making sure that you think about what your customer needs, think about how much you really need that data. I guess privacy by design is one of the great things I think actually works as well in terms of engaging with the customers and earning that trust.
A really good example of that is then looking at, say, OTP or moving into in-app authentication. So if I'm trying to access something, or if I'm trying to access your portal via web, but then I have to open your app to authenticate myself, but then I go back to a computer on a website, what's the point of that? The actual user experience has been circumvented and you've taken me down sort of multiple paths. just because it's more convenient for you to authenticate me inside your app. So you do take away from that user experience. It's a balance, but it can be tricky.
It's a balance that I hope technology can fix. Yeah. But I guess we have to get through those phases as well.
David, so you work with industry in terms of helping them shape their identity systems, the broader identity ecosystem. How are you seeing industry balance convenience and trust?
Yeah, it's a big one right now, I guess, as well, with a lot of the fraud and scams framework coming along. Large banks in particular are trying to figure out how do they protect consumers through making sure they're not being scammed by getting in the way, if you like, finding out why they're doing this. But at the same time, they don't want to get in the way because they don't want, when they don't need to. Like if there's no fraud going on, we don't want to ask you questions or try to get in the way of friction. So a lot of people are trying now, a lot of organisations are really trying to now is how can they put that dynamic friction in place? How can they use technology to understand what's going on? Is there biometric signals that are saying there might be some coaching going on? Or, is this a person, are they transferring it to an account known for cryptocurrency exchanges? So a lot of organisations are right now trying to get that balance right between getting in the way of a transaction, but also for the ones that don't need to, letting it go through quickly.
Yeah, I think you previously spoke about intelligent friction, which I really love. A panel, I think 2 panels ago, one of the panellists was saying that frictionless is really out of favour now. And so I think that there's definitely an element of friction. Stuart, so, fintech's disrupted lending by by delivering personalisation and trust to the consumer. So how do you see fintechs adopting, embracing, disrupting digital identity? What is going to be the community's response?
It's through collaboration. So this is a whole of economy, whole of ecosystem response that's needed. So fintechs need to participate in that. Whether it is that you are, a company that's lending versus an actual digital identity company to a bank, to a government, to a regulator, and everybody in between. The question is, there's going to be, where does that onus sit as we go through the next couple of years, whatever period it is that takes us to reach sort of nirvana for digital trust? And that's probably a never sort of, it's an endpoint that's always continuously moving away. But where does the onus sit and who does it sit on? And what is an acceptable loss? And what is an unacceptable loss? So I could walk across the road and I could not look and I could get hit by a car, but do we put barriers up everywhere? No, but we put barriers up in some places. We put barriers up on freeways where there are cars going at 100 kilometres an hour. We have speed limits, we have other things in place. But there's an equilibrium that needs to be met somewhere there. From a fintech perspective, there will always be a push around what is the ultimate sort of better outcome, better user experience. What's the better mousetrap? And I think that really then comes down to as a check on it and a push where and it's an interesting sort of, I guess, agency relationship where a new fintech or a new startup that sort of has nothing to lose and everything to gain is more than happy to push the boundaries. But if you're sitting there as a government and you're worried about, mums and dads and grandmothers losing money, then that's the life savings. That can be quite devastating. And of course, if you're a bank, it doesn't matter who it is and why it was and what happened. It's always going to be the bank's fault for the customer being defrauded. So there's this weird sort of agency relationship that's going on that's not yet reached an equilibrium, but then gets to a sensible conversation like look both ways before you cross the road. What is the digital trust equivalent of look both ways?
So, John, before we turn our attention to the consumer, I know that the government has actually spent a lot of time engaging with industry to try and work out how do we roll out digital identity, not just in government, but across our entire economy. And so, there's a room full of financial institutions here. Help us understand what is some of the work that the Australian government is doing to enable the private sector with digital identity.
I'll probably just mention a couple of things. We've currently got some pilots initiated, so we put an expression of interest out to the market a little while ago for accredited digital ID providers from the private sector to join with consumer data right accredited providers and real estate to look at how can we make the renter experience easier and stop oversharing personal documentation and personal financial information. So that's one way. We've got a lot of interest from that in the private sector to really look at some of those use cases, but importantly, identify where there is too much, where the regulations need to change to enable that kind of use and stop the overcollection of documents, etc. In parallel, we're also doing the work over the next 12 and a bit months to enable the private sector accredited providers to apply to join the Australian government system to start to drive some of that future whole of economy interoperability that we've talked about. And really start to drive value from our digital IDs that are there. But those two things can definitely happen in parallel.
And if you could give private sector and fintechs one tip or one piece of advice as you're trying to roll this out to them, what would that be that they maybe haven't thought of yet?
Government officials don't give advice, they merely provide a framework for you to consider your whole...
Stuart, the direction was not directed at you.
I'm not a regulator, it's okay. So, look, I don't know if there's one tip you haven't thought of, so it would just be get on with it, if anything, and I'm sure you've thought of that, and work with us, talk to us, we're very happy to engage. Where is the challenges, where are the blockers, and how can we help?
Fantastic. So that's really about industry, so businesses adopting digital identity, but let's talk about the consumer who's really going to drive that adoption. So David, I mean, I'm grappling with, my 13-year-old who organises her life on Snapchat and my 24-year-old who really effectively runs rings around me on all counts. So what does earning trust look like for both of those generations when they're surrounded by AI assistants, biometrics, daily attempts of scams? What does that look like for the consumers?
Well, for the 20-year-olds, I've got a 20-year-old and they've lived with Snapchat. Yeah. They won't share, find my family that I have on Apple. They won't let me know where they are, so I have to ring their friends because they know exactly where they are on Snapchat. And Snapchat's only got to that point because they've taken a privacy by design approach. They've taken an approach which is actually quite transparent as well. They do periodic, biannual type of reviews. They try to understand the customer. They really try to understand what does trust mean, what do we need to do to get enough trust in these people to actually share their life, share where they are, share with it. I was walking down, we were in the middle of the markets in Kyoto a few years ago, and my son goes, oh yeah, my mate's just over there. And then went over there and caught up. It's like, Snapchat obviously have found a framework around which balances that. They've earned the trust through making sure they've understood what they need. And also, the other one as well is I think that they are good in the way they respond to problems. Like Estonia as well. Estonia did the same thing. They have a large trust because there was a data breach, and one of the best things that came out of that, well, it was a crypto issue or some issue in 2017 or such. What came out of that was that they responded to it, they shut it down, and then they addressed it all transparently. It didn't really undermine the system, that actually strengthened it, because then the community, the citizens knew what to expect, and they knew that they could trust this, and if something goes wrong, they'll find out about it.
So I was watching the news this morning actually, and I know it's been in the news beforehand, but Kmart has been given a slap on the wrist again more formally today about, I think the language that was used by the journalist was indiscriminate use of facial biometrics in certain stores. I can see a few heads nodding, so I've got that right. Stuart, with your background in fintechs and being close to the consumer, how do you see these sorts of risks shaping consumer adoption of digital identity and digital trust?
I'm a little bit befuddled, not to hate on anybody who shops at Kmart, but what is Kmart discriminating against with respect to the customer base? No, but this actually becomes a very real issue though, right? And you've seen this through other aspects of financial services and other aspects of tech as there is an inherent bias that starts to get built. It goes back to the redlining in the mortgage industry in US banking, where people who live in this postcode we're not going to lend to. Why? Because they're bad loans, but it turns out that's a massive African American population. So you've now discriminated. As you jump forward and you have AI models, you jump forward the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, we're aware of that and we're able to manage that. as you now have AI-led models, models that are AI-led and AI-driven, those biases are actually coming back and being revisited and inadvertently being replicated again. And that's sort of something that then creates a real challenge. Whether it's around socioeconomic discrimination, if it's around racial discrimination, there's an example I've seen of fingerprints and farmers. Now one of the business I'm involved in is AgPay, so I'm aptly looking at things that are around agriculture. If you work 15, 16 hours a day on the land, turns out you don't actually have fingerprints. So if the ID verification for me is my fingerprint, well, that's actually really, really hard. And if that becomes the way that I'm identified, acknowledged, integrated, accepted, well, that's an inadvertent discrimination against people who are in manual labour. Sorry, you jump. No, you go. But what that also then gets to is then thinking about the different perspectives. Like your example just before of your kids. We need to think about what does somebody who's digital native actually think about this? If my life is on social media already anyway, I've actually got nothing to lose and I probably don't care. Now that's a bit of an overstatement, but that's very, very different to somebody who, is 46 years old and sort of worked in and out of banking and fintechs, which is very different to my mother who's 71 and doesn't use internet banking because that's how hackers get your money. But if that's the sort of thing that you're dealing with and everything in between, from somebody who is finding their mates on Snapchat while overseas, first problem there was you shouldn't have given them a data plan, but that's okay. but through to my mother who doesn't trust the internet because of hackers, like that's a massive spectrum that we have to then solve for, which is really, really complicated.
Yeah, it's interesting. That reminds me of a few of my colleagues have heard me say this story. My dad, who's 84, so in that bracket, called me, this was about 2 months ago, absolutely incensed that his bank had asked him to open his mouth in front of his phone and turn his head side to side. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that the bank was using our biometrics capability, but the point there is, and I still haven't told him, but the point is that the consumer experience as it relates to digital identity is obviously not a one-size-fits-all. We need to think about something that is context-aware. So what are we trying to do? Yes, perhaps biometrics is appropriate for high-value transactions, but maybe, Stuart, to your point, in-store at Kmart, what is going on there? And so it's, we have to be very sensitive and thoughtful. That's my personal opinion anyway, in terms of what we're using and when and with who.
To argue the counter, that could have been a honey trap for your dad to get facial recording so that there can be a deep fake of your dad, which is now going to...
Getting catfished when he's dating or something.
But this is the world that it'll be solved for, but it's the world that we're in, and it's murky and confusing.
John, I know that I'd like you to talk a little bit about the way that the government is thinking about inclusion for consumers. And so as we're trying to be inclusive for everyone, there is that creates a tension and a conflict with everybody uses digital identity in different ways. But talk to us a little bit about inclusion from a government's perspective.
I was going to say, try writing policy for all of those kind of age brackets and legislation that applies in all of those things around use of biometrics. No, so digital ID is voluntary in Australia. You've heard that lots of times, I suspect, over the last couple of years. Identifying yourself in lots of scenarios is not. So we've got a real conundrum in Australia, and I think it's sad. In 2025, we have a good proportion of Australians who struggle to, and people who live in Australia who struggle to identify themselves for basic transactions, to open a bank account, to rent a house, to do all sorts of things. And there's a range of reasons why that is. A lot of it goes back to the source documents, that they can't access their birth certificate, or they never had a birth certificate, or their marriage certificate doesn't come through the document verification service correctly, and therefore when they go to verify themselves, it just gives a big no. So there's lots of that. It's not just 1 or 2%, it's bigger than that. Our digital ID system and our verification services work really well for those people they work really well for. But if you know someone who actually struggles through that stuff, it is a real battle. So we're doing some work at the moment with the WA government to look at particularly focused into First Nations communities in remote and regional areas, looking at this basic thing of underdocumented people and how can we use things like vouching processes potentially to actually help give people confidence that people are who they say they are and allow them to participate, to start with, at least with government services, so they don't have to travel many miles to get to shop fronts and things like that, but to basically take advantage of basic digital services. But it is a huge issue and it's not one that's going to solve quickly, but we need to work collectively with industry, governments at all levels to try to solve.
On vouching, where did you get to on safety net? So if organisation A vouches for consumer with organisation B, but that turns out to be fraudulent, who's responsible?
We're still working through that liability, of course, of all of that stuff. So the basic premise is knowing this person through their being identified through a digital ID, being able to vouch for somebody else. But there are all sorts of complexities, of course, in that in terms of liability, but also just not making that person more vulnerable at the same time, but also helping them. So the balance is challenging.
Which then becomes interesting, because then you say, what if we take a graduated approach and you can vouch for some things, but if you're not sure, then go through and do a full ID. That's sensible.
So there are services, I think, here in Victoria where people have, a financial institution can vouch for a customer, for example, to allow them to get their access to government services because they've had a relationship. But none of these things come without a balancing of risk that has to occur, and we need to think differently about those things.
David, we're talking about building out a national digital trust infrastructure. Kind of sounds expensive. You're working with industry on this right now. So from your perspective, who can afford to build it and sustain it, and who should?
It's been expensive. I think we need to build on what we've spent on, and I think there's a good platform there to start on. There's still a lot more to do, though, which I guess is part of the concern. We need to make it easier to participate, easier on board and consume and participate in that ecosystem. But also I think there's a new layer that we haven't yet thought of, that's coming, and that's one that I guess the more we see agentic services, the more we're going to need to answer questions around consent. If we thought consent was bad within CDR, just imagine what happens when 15 different digital agents start working for me. So we need to look at how do we solve for consent and almost unload it to an ecosystem and give it purpose, and then allow us to anchor off that a bit more. So there's, and then on top of that, as they say, agents, don't let an agent loose without signals. So we need to almost create standards and a framework to allow participants to share signals between each other, so that when something does go a bit wrong, or that as an organisation you've got a risk appetite that's quite high, you can at least use the signals that's coming from your network or from the system to say, what should I do with this transaction? And maybe introduce some more friction. Maybe ask them to step up, or find out their purpose or what's their intent in doing this transaction to help that. So I think we've got the foundations of it, which is good. It's open, it's federated, but there's still more to go. I think we're on a journey for a bit longer.
Yeah, I think signals, I spoke at the start about, who should be enabling those identity verifications securely, but that's for both businesses and consumers, which signals are right for who and when. Just before we turn to the audience for any questions from the audience, I did want to ask the panellists your perspective. So, and who wants to go first? Who will own digital trust in 2030?
I'll own it, apparently. I think the easy answer is we all need to own it. That was part of my message. We have to work together on a framework that actually is shared. And it can't be all done by government. All the work can't be done, and all the costs can't be impaired by governments, and by Commonwealth government at that. And our system is a shared one now. So I think we've got to. And what I will say is positive from my perspective is every time I talk to people in industry and across state and territory governments, we all have the same goal. We're all trying to do the same things, not necessarily in the same ways all the time or at the same speed with the same budgets. But we're all trying to achieve the same goal, and everyone shares the same stories.
Stuart?
I agree entirely, and I'd go a step further and say it's not just everyone that owns it, but everybody has an accountability to protect the integrity of the digital ID, let's go with infrastructure, but also to educate and not scaremonger on the way through. So, for example, if a government's coming out and saying, digital ID is okay, and a financial institution is immediately saying, are you sure this could be fraud? How blah blah blah, whatever the messaging is there. If that's the message you're giving an end consumer, and every time they interact with, let's go with internet banking, they get a question of, are you sure this could be fraud? That's a great way to undermine years of effort from government, from industry, around providing a safe environment for people to be able to transact. And so it's a combination of not just owning it, but protecting the integrity of it as well, and recognising there's something that's greater than the individual company.
David?
Yeah, I can't disagree. Yeah, everyone look. The thing is, if you're not owning identity, everyone's not trying to own digital trust, they're not making it their thing, I don't think they're going to succeed, because people are going to pick it up pretty quickly. So I'd be doing my best to do whatever I can do to make sure I create an experience and I build as much trust as I can, the technologies and the platforms and the relationships with my customers.
I just remembered, so the answer there was Equifax. Equifax should own. Is that right?
You're such a rogue panelist, Stuart. I would say, I would agree. However, I just would like to clarify the nuance. When we say that everybody owns it, I think there is a difference between everybody doing something about it versus actually everybody working together to create that ecosystem. And I think Marnie Baker spoke about that on day one in terms of, there's a few heads, so some of you heard her say that, industry titans, she doesn't believe in one, she believes in the ecosystem being the titan. And so, for what it's worth, from an Equifax perspective, we're certainly advocates of the ecosystem being the titan. Yes, John.
Can I just add a point to that? Because I should have said before is, and what are you doing in your own organisation to bring this to life? And I'll start with how are you onboarding employees? How are you doing your pre-employment checks? Are you using digital ID in your own organisations?
That's a fantastic question.
I got a great example, and this was a year ago, so I hope it's changed from now. But I tried to use a digital ID where I had to produce photo ID to enter a building, and they only accepted physical driver's license. I'm like, but this is a driver's license. And it just hadn't caught up. So there's a whole iterative loop there as well.
That is still happening in a lot of places. But I went across to finance to lead the digital ID task force a couple of years ago, and what do you think I had to provide via email? All my personal documents.
4 pieces of identity.
And sent across. So I'm on a mission at the Department of Finance and across the Commonwealth Government, I can tell you, to sort this out.
Yeah, that's true. It's not just account onboarding.
And I will have on the theme of everyone owning it and kind of working through it together.
Yeah.
The Open Idea Foundation runs the Australian Digital Trust Community Group. Operates, it's a phone call, it's a conference call on Monday afternoons. The purpose of that is getting together as a community to understand what needs to be done and how can we work through these things. So it's open to all, but it is an active thing that there's about 60 or 70 participants. We get about 20 each week. But please, if you're interested in progressing digital trust and understanding more about that, please join.
Fantastic. So I think that the key takeout for everyone in the audience is, first of all, thanks for everyone for coming and listening to our panel today. And in terms of participating in digital trust, don't just participate as a singular entity, but participate in an ecosystem. In the last 30-second or 1 minute, does anyone have any questions for our esteemed panel here, which represents a wide range of perspectives from government, industry and FinTech? Yes.
So first, thank you for sharing all your insights. Maybe a question on blockchain and decentralization. How do you see that playing a role in digital ID and digital ID across FinTech and so on?
That sounds like a David question.
Oh, blockchain decentralization? For identity? Yeah, look, there's work to be done. It's interesting because right now there's a lot of work being done between AI and identity, bringing the two together. I think the same thing still has to happen to that. How do we get that Web 2 digital ID onto Web 3? I think they're questions which I think there is even some work being done in government on how does that work too, because it helps settlement and those sorts of things. That's as much as I know.
John?
I'm happy to talk, given the time, I'm happy to talk to people afterwards if they'd like to talk about some exploration we're doing around verifiable credentials.
That's an invitation. Any other questions? Fantastic. Please put your hands together for this great panel, and thank you very much for your time, everyone.